Hey, it's Andy here. Before we get started, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone who downloaded and listened to the show so far. We've had listeners from over 37 countries check it out. By the way, if you have time and it's appropriate, please go to the show on iTunes and write a review. This lets other people know what you think of the show and where to find us. Finally, as always, there's an important disclaimer at the end of the podcast you should listen to. Okay, on to the show. By the way, this next guest had an amazing experience in his career, and we're going to get to it right away. Welcome to CFTC Talks. I'm your host, Andy Bush. This week, we return to the 2008 financial crisis to find out what it means for policy today. Remember, our goal is to learn about market dynamics, liquidity, and fragmentation. To this end, we bring on Professor Hal Scott. Now, he is the Nomura Professor and Director of the Program on International Financial Systems at Harvard Law School, where he has taught since 1975. He teaches courses on capital markets regulation, international finance, and security regulation. His books include the law school textbook, International Finance, Transactions, Policy, and Regulation. He also has a book, Connectedness and Contagion, and then lastly, The Global Financial Crisis. Professor Scott is the president and director of the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation. This is a bipartisan nonprofit organization dedicated to enhancing the competitiveness of U.S. capital markets and ensuring the stability of the U.S. financial system via research and advocacy. You can find this at capmarksreg.org. That's CAPMKTSREG.org. Hal, welcome to CFTC Talks.
Happy to be with you.
Hal, before we jump into finance and regulations, I wanted to ask you about your career in education. You have a BA from Princeton, an MA from Stanford, and a JD from the University of Chicago Law School.
That's right. I have no degree from Harvard, though.
Well, full disclosure, I'm a graduate alumni of the University of Chicago, so I'm glad to see at least one of the places that you got degrees from is reputable.
Great place. Really enjoyed it there.
Good. Just for all my general counsel people, that was a joke. I was kidding out there. But I have to ask you about this. Hal, in 1974 and 1975, before joining Harvard, you clerked for Justice Byron White.
That's right.
Did you get to work on U.S. versus Nixon?
Yes. Well, sort of. The case came to us, I think, at the beginning of the summer, so I was there when it came, but I was in transition between myself and the next clerk occurred before the decision was actually written. So I was there at the beginning, but not the end.
Wow, but what a fascinating time to be at the Supreme Court. What lessons did you take away from that?
Well, I think, I was very fortunate to have a justice who is very even-keeled and had been through a lot of crises in his own life, from the football field to being the Deputy Attorney General to Bobby Kennedy, dealing with, integration in the South. So, seeing it from his position, he's very even-keeled, very fair, looking at the merits of the situation. You come away from that with a great appreciation of the importance of the Supreme Court in the life of the United States.
Well, and I think in that particular case, too, it was so central to so many things that have gone on since because it dealt with executive privilege.
Yeah, it's sort of like, are we going to be back there soon or not? It was a fascinating situation. But I think I was very impressed by the fact that the general population was ready to convict Nixon, without any evidence, but the way the Supreme Court worked in terms of dealing with that whole situation, it was very dispassionate, based on the law, based on the evidence, and a very good process.
And I think that's so critical for anything that's happened since that time and going forward to just focus on the law. So what a wonderful time for you to be there. That's amazing. Well, let's shift gears a little bit to the present. And since you are an expert on financial systems, obviously, and I enjoyed reading your book, what do you think is the current health of the U.S. financial structure?
Well, in some ways it's overly healthy, and in some ways it's underly healthy. So,
break that down for us. Tell us what do you think it's like overdone with, and what do you think it's underdone with?
Yeah, I think we're overdoing it with capital and liquidity requirements. Kind of a reaction, obviously, to the crisis, but I think we're trying to prevent something at a level of prevention that is so unlikely to occur. And on the other hand, we're going to pay and are paying a stiff price in current economic activity to prevent something at levels of prevention that are excessive. So I think we're overly healthy, but our financial system is healthy, very healthy, but it's at the cost of more productive activity in the economy. So that's the over-healthy side. The under-healthy side, which is really the subject of my book, Connectedness and Contagion, is that, if you go back to 2008, the heart of the problem was a run on the financial system that went into full-scale mode after the Lehman failure.
Right.
So immediately upon that failure, we had a run on the money market funds, first on the Reserve Primary Fund, which actually had a connection to Lehman, but that spread to all sorts of money market funds, had no connection to Lehman, and then credit just froze up in the entire economy. People would not lend short-term, and if they had short-term money that was turning over, they took it away and wouldn't renew it.
Mm-hmm.
And the Fed responded magnificently to this problem by playing the role that they were created to play in 1913 as a lender of last resort. And they created all sorts of new facilities, lent to both banks and non-banks through these facilities, and really, I think, stabilized the system, long before TARP came into effect. If the Fed had not played that role,
right,
we would have been toast, in my judgment. But in the aftermath of this all, the Fed's role was characterized as a bailout of Wall Street. They did do a little of that when they lent to AIG, which was insolvent, but most of the lending that they did was to completely solvent institutions, which they should lend to in a financial panic. And so as a result of that, in Dodd-Frank, major restrictions were put on the role as lender of last resort, primarily to non-banks, which, by the way, constitute about 60% of the runnable liabilities in our system today, so it's really important. And politically, the environment of the Fed's exercising this role is bad. There's sort of an alliance between the left and the right on this, saying, the Fed's bad to bail out Wall Street. So you can't have a stable financial system with a weak lender of last resort. That's kind of the bottom line here.
Right.
And so I would say we're not healthy. If we were to come into another crisis of the kind we had in 2008, the weapons at the disposal of the Fed would now be limited.
Let me back you up to your book again. Of all the books I've read and research I've read on the 2008 financial crisis, I thought your book, Connectedness and Contagion, was one of the most thorough and cogent discussions on the subject. And you make the case that the major issue, obviously, which is what you were just saying, the major issue for our current financial system is not connectedness, but contagion. Just unpack that a little bit more for our audience, because as for myself, I was sitting in a big capital markets trading room, and I will tell you that so much of it was the inability of people to understand who had what on their balance sheets. And so that aids to this uncertainty, which I think is kind of underlying what you're saying here on the difference between connectedness and contagion.
Right. Well, a couple of things on that. First of all, on the contagion front, some degree of contagion when people run on Bank X because there's a problem in Bank Y is to some extent a lack of information because they don't know whether X is in exactly the same position as Y.
Correct.
So it's kind of as a result of lack of fundamental information of the kind you were talking about, not knowing the balance sheet. But on the other hand, we've had a lot of panics in which people say, look, by the way, we're never going to know in real time exactly what the balance sheet is.
Right.
Because it's changing by the second, right?
The values change as the market changes.
Yeah, exactly. So there's always uncertainty when you come into these kind of potential financial panic situations, even with better disclosure.
Yeah, great point.
Even if
great
we,
point.
Knew what the derivatives position was yesterday of everybody, we're not sure that's the position right now.
Yep.
So I'd say we have people saying, I don't know what the situation is, I'm getting out. And you can reduce that, but you're never going to eliminate that. Now, on the other hand, I think there were assumptions in the market, which I think, or maybe I should say of policymakers, not so much in the market, that there was this high degree of interconnectedness problem, so that if AIG went down, Goldman was going to go down. Or if Lehman went down, counterparties to Lehman on derivatives particularly were going to go down. This is mostly derivative related. My research shows that wasn't the case. Hard to really find any major counterparty of Lehman that was affected on the derivatives book from the failure of Lehman. There just isn't any. And if you go to AIG, which of course was bailed out, so we don't really know what would happen. They never defaulted on the derivatives position. But if they had defaulted on it, the data is that the exposure on capital of the major counterparties, when you take into effect collateral, netting, and hedging, was not going to bankrupt any of their counterparties.
Right. I think, let me just stop you there really quick, because I think that's such an important point, because everybody was so concerned about the notional values of CDS and what AIG had and what they had written on the CDS that I think it blew out of proportion what the exposure was, which is your point.
Yeah, that's a netting point. But even if you kind of looked at the real exposure, okay, there is real exposure. If AIG had defaulted, the effect on Goldman would have been about 18% of its capital. But that didn't take into effect the hedges that Goldman had written on AIG, and so they had CDSs that paid off if AIG itself failed, which hedged their exposure of AIG's failure to settle its positions with Goldman. And so when you take all that into account, there is exposure. I mean, there's always counterparty exposure in any financial system. But I know that people who work in finance and for firms know that Risk 101 is having a really good system to control counterparty exposure right across all counterparty positions.
Yes.
And firms like Goldman know how to do that. So I guess what I'm saying is that people were worried about connectedness in the crisis, largely because they really didn't know these things that we're talking about right now. But when you look back on it, it was really the financial panic run concern that was much more important than the counterparty position.
Yeah, and I think that's super important for people to understand that contagion is the most virulent and most important part of the systemic risk that's still facing the financial system today, because it creates this chain reaction of failures. And I think central to this is your contention that a stronger lender of last resort would provide the system the ability to deal with a contagion crisis or even avert one just by the market knowing that this is there. Did I get that right?
Absolutely. So if you have a strong lender of last resort, the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, will do whatever it takes attitude deters the run in the first place. So you don't really have the problem.
Yeah, it's so important. I mean, and I think, when we look back at the sequence of what the Fed was doing at that time, eventually they came around to that position to some extent where they knew interest rates were not going to just do it. They needed to do more, aid the economy more, and eventually provide comfort. I think it was the 60 Minutes interview with Ben Bernanke back in March of 2009 that finally did it, where, he basically said no bank is going to fail. And I think that's the equivalent of Draghi's, do whatever it takes.
Yeah, but I should say on that score that I do not think it's the role of the Fed to make sure no bank fails, okay? The role of the Fed is to provide liquidity to solvent institutions. When there was a run on Goldman and Morgan Stanley,
right
after Lehman, those were two solvent institutions. But for the run, okay, if the run had persisted, they were going to be insolvent because they're going to have to liquidate their assets at fire sale prices to pay off the short-term credit. That's far different, in my view, than what the Fed did with AIG's holding company, which was insolvent. And they lent to it big time, $85 billion.
Right.
And I think that is inappropriate. Now, they were under the gun. That occurred. What happened is Lehman failed. the weekend before, there was this unanticipated run on the system, and then the AIG crops up on the following Monday. There's total panic, so they reached out and saved AIG. But that wasn't ideal. What we should have had was the ability of the Treasury as a fiscal party here, which is really a fiscal decision because you were lending to an insolvent institution, basically a bailout. It was a bailout of AIG. That should have been much more of a Treasury decision, but we were operating in a world where we hadn't anticipated all this.
Mm-hmm.
Going forward, we should have a much better procedure for dealing with these kind of situations, not only a strong lender of last resort, but coordinated with the fiscal capability of the U.S. Treasury, that in an emergency, that they have the ability to act.
Right. So
and of course, we have much better resolution procedures now, too, which we didn't have back then.
Well, let me ask you about that. So how has regulation since 2008 approached this issue? Because I believe we have new capital liquidity requirements, additional new liquidity requirements, new resolution procedures that are all part of Dodd-Frank.
Yeah.
So how do you think this is, with what you've said, has the regulation moved in the direction that you would like to see it?
Well, it goes back to overly healthy. In my view, because we have a weak lender of last resort, that drives a couple of things. First of all, it says, look, we never want to be in the position of having a run, so let's make sure we have more than enough capital to avoid that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're never going to have enough capital because the levels we have, even if you were up to, what some people like Admati would want, 25%, in a run is never going to be enough. Okay. But more is better. So if you think you've got a problem with contagion and you're not sure you're going to be able to handle it, you're going to demand more capital. But the cost of that more capital is lack of economic activity. And the second thing is, while we've improved our resolution system enormously to be able to handle failure, now think about the situation where Jamie Dimon calls up Stephen Mnuchin today and says, hey, entitled to her bankruptcy tomorrow. Now, I don't think Mnuchin's response to that is, no problem, we have a resolution procedure. What he's going to think about is what's going to happen the next day to the U.S. financial system and indeed the world's financial system as everybody heads for the woods here.
Right.
I don't care. There's uncertainty. Will these procedures work? What's going to happen? Better safe than sorry. I'm getting out. Thank you very much. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, and Mnuchin is going to know that, the Fed has got its hands tied a little bit here because of Dodd-Frank. And so the ability of the Fed to handle this contagion on, Monday after this significant entry into bankruptcy is going to be limited. So I think what Mr. Mnuchin would have to do is play Paulson and trot up with his term sheet to the Congress to say, give me the money to handle this situation. Mm. If we had a stronger lender of last resort, we would have less need for capital, in my judgment, and more likely to accept resolution of insolvent institutions. So we would actually have less bailouts as a result.
So I have to ask you, and you brought this up earlier, because this is really the elephant in the room, is like, how does one address the public perception of bailing out Wall Street? I mean, that drove a lot of some of the thinking, for sure, with AIG on when they started crafting regulation and reducing the leeway that the Fed and the Treasury could have to engage in that type of activity going forward. So how do you address that? I mean, if you're talking to people in Congress, which you do all the time, what do you tell them about this? Because surely this is on their mind.
Well, that's a very tough problem. But I think that the concern comes from two political sides. First of all, the left, which I'm not sure I could ever make happy on this, because basically their problem with the Fed is where the money's going. Okay, they don't want Wall Street to get this money because they think banks are, in some sense, evil and responsible for all of our problems. On the conservative side, it's a different concern. The conservatives, and here I think rightly so to some extent, are worried about the Fed as sort of lacking discretion, doing whatever they want, out of control, not politically accountable, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you see this on the monetary policy side with the Taylor rule and kind of rule of law. We need to know what the limits are, what the Fed's going to do. Now, that is a problem that I think is addressable. That is that I think that the Fed should do a much better job laying out its policy of lender of last resort, how it would think about whether an institution is insolvent. I mean, there's no definitive answer to that, but there is a way of thinking about it, how they would coordinate with the Treasury, what facilities they would use, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a large part of the conservative problem is lack of transparency and clarity around the Fed's role.
So you think if they provide...
It has to be clear that the Fed would not lend to what was clearly an insolvent institution.
So you think if they delineated the framework by which they're going to use, then we would see some comfort probably on both sides for this issue of bailing out Wall Street?
Well, I'm not sure we would on the left, but I'm pretty sure we would on the right, because some elements of the left just think banks are bad and they don't want them to get money. It's just like, that's it. There's no way that can be addressed. But they're responsible, let's say more not as extreme positions on the left, which are very much similar to what's on the right, that we need more transparency, we need to be clear, and we don't want to bail out insolvent institutions. So the way forward to me on this is a stronger lender of last resort and a better framework.
Well, before I let you go, let's peer into the future just a little bit. Where do you see regulation heading here in the U.S.?
I see it heading towards a somewhat relaxation of the high levels of capital and liquidity requirements. This does not require legislation. This can be done through the regulators, particularly the Fed, and that will change as new Fed appointments are made. Randy Quarles is now in the mix for Fed Vice Chair. Once he assumes his role there, I think you're going to see not abandoning, but a kind of a serious tweaking of the capital and liquidity requirements. So I see that happening. I think the Volcker rule, we're already seeing it's not going to be repealed. The legislation won't change, but again, the implementation of it will change. That's already underway. Comptroller of the Currency has already, put out there some suggestions for readjusting it. So I see in those areas changes, but no major legislation here. There isn't a majority for it. I do see changes in the way our existing laws are implemented. And by the way, the capital and liquidity requirements that the system has is really not kind of dictated by Dodd-Frank. It's more sort of regulatory policy. It's the Basel Committee. So there's lots of discretion there for the Fed to change those rules. I don't think they'll be changed wholesale, but I do think there'll be significant tweaks.
Hal Scott, Harvard professor and president of the Committee on Capital Markets Regulations. Thanks for coming on the show today.
My pleasure.
That's it for me this week. Please subscribe to the podcast by going to iTunes and searching for CFTC Talks, or you can listen to the podcast by going to our website, cftc.gov, and click on the podcast button. We'll be back next week with another guest on our quest to learn about the markets we watch. I'm Andy Bush. Thanks for listening. CFTC is providing this information as a public service and is neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of CFTC policy. Reference to any specific product, service, trademark, manufacturer, or service provider does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the CFTC. The CFTC is not liable to any consumer or third party for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, special, or exemplary damages or lost profit related to the use of the information provided or referenced in the podcast. Selection of guests on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of any particular individual or entity. Many individuals and entities provided similar services to those of the guests. The views and opinions expressed by the guest in the podcast are their own and not specifically endorsed by the CFTC. Moreover, the information provided in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Consumers should rely on their own inquiries as to the accuracy and relevance of the information incorporated and referenced in this podcast and assume the entire risk related to its use. The CFTC is providing this interpretation of market trends solely to inform the public of a framework for projecting future outcomes under different scenarios. If you have any questions concerning the meaning or application of a particular law or rule administered by the CFTC, please consult with an attorney.